Hebrews 10. Anybody feel like reading?
Read a little bit. Let's see here. All right. For the law having a shadow of good things to come, not the very image of the things, they can never with the same sacrifices year by year, which they offer continually make perfect them that draw nigh. Else would they not have ceased to be offered, because the worshippers, having been once cleansed, would have had no more conscience of sins. But in those sacrifices there is a remembrance made of sins year by year. For it is impossible that blood of bulls and goats should take away sins. Wherefore, when he cometh into the world, he saith, Sacrifice and offering thou wouldest not, but a body didst thou prepare for me. In whole burnt offerings and sacrifice for sin thou had no pleasure. Then said I, Lo, I am come to do the will of God, saying above, sacrifices and offering, and whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin, thou wouldest not, neither had pleasure therein. Then he has said, Lo, I am come to do thy will. He take away the first that he may establish the second, by which will he have been sacrificed through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. I'll stop there. I was trying to read the easy reading version, but I actually pulled up the English Revised Version.
Yeah,
It sounded okay. I mean, is
There's
there
a
a break
little,
right there? I don't know if there is a break. I mean,
nah, it breaks in 18 in this version anyhow.
okay. I'll read to 18 then.
Okay.
I'm reading out of my Hebraic Roots Bible. It says a literal translation is what it says. But you can take that, what you want. All right, verse 11. And indeed, every priest stands day by day ministering and often offering the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But he, offering but one sacrifice for sin, sat down in perpetuity at the right hand of Yahweh. From then on, expecting until his enemies are placed as a footstool under his feet. For by one offering he has perfected in perpetuity the ones being sanctified, and the Holy Spirit witnesses us also. For after having said before, this is the covenant which I will covenant to them after those days, says Yahweh, giving my Torah on their hearts, and I will write them on their minds. Also, he adds, I will not at all still remember their sins and their lawless deeds. But where remission of these is, there is no longer offering concerning sin.
So in verse 16, did you guys see what I thought where it said after those days? After what days do you guys think?
Um, I mean, is this not just like the same phrase that's like Acts chapter 3 that Peter uses? Like Samuel and all the prophets spoke of these days, like Joel's prophecy in chapter Acts 2, 16, 17. God says, in the last days, I will pour out my spirit. Like when Peter quotes Joel, he calls it the last days. But Joel's original prophecy didn't say last days. Joel's original prophecy said after this. So
Yeah, I've actually heard the argument that the new covenant started when Jeremiah was given that prophecy.
I heard that recently also.
Yeah, it's just like that makes absolutely no sense. In my mind, it's talking about the first century because that's when these scriptures are actually being applied as being fulfilled.
Yeah,
This
why
Yeah,
is the
would
that's why I
time
was thinking
period
that
in
the
which,
after these days seems to be sometime during
yeah,
or after the first century, sort of, or after. I was thinking maybe if after those days meant like, the culmination of the holy people being shattered or scattered, however you want to put it, you know, then the new covenant's fully established potentially. and if it's after those days, then that pretty much destroys the idea that he came just during the first century.
Yeah, it would definitely either be 80-30 time period or 80-70. It's definitely first century. It's not before that or after that. Like like when it's getting, you know, set up or whatever. Because in the context, it's being set up like after the time period with the animal sacrifices, right? So that's obviously going on in the first century. I mean, in my mind, the animal sacrifices no longer had uh, any type of covering after the cross because Jesus was, the perfect sacrifice. The veil was torn. I guess we're about to get into that in the next few verses, but um, like God
Yeah,
had
but
covered.
in Hebrews 8, we saw they were fading away. So, I mean, they're still going all the way up to the temple. So, to me, it seems
Well, it
like,
was obsolete and fading, right? So it's like in God's eyes, like
right.
it's a dead corpse, but the people were still outwardly practicing the things, right? Because it's not like they woke up one day. Like it's not like we look 2,000 years, we look backwards and we have all of God's revelation, and so we tend to read these things like a light switch or like the cross happened, and then the next day it's like okay, no more old covenant. Like that might be true in God's eyes, but that's not what they understood. Like it took an entire generation. It took a whole 40 years for people to finally understand that that's not God's religion anymore. So,
Yeah, I mean, even in verse 9, how it says, I come to do your will, O God. He takes away the first in order that he may set up or establish the second. And that word he takes away is Strong's number 337. In my Bible, I did not write it in Greek at that time. But there are places where that word is used, and it literally means to like kill or destroy.
yeah,
Um,
it's used
Acts
24 times.
nine twenty
Yep,
three.
yep,
They're gonna
yep.
kill or do away with Paul. In the Greek Septuagint, you have Exodus 2:14.
The
Um,
it's used 24 times in the New Testament. The first time it's used is in Matthew 2:16. When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he became furious and same Greek word, all the male children around Bethlehem. Right?
Yeah, Exodus 2:14, this is where it says, and he said, who appointed you a man, a ruler, and a judge over us? Are you saying to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? For Moses feared, said, surely the thing is known. Yeah, that one, yeah, so that, so it's kind of like, what is the first one? So he takes away the first in order to establish, and then this word establish is I don't think I wrote the number down. Maybe
Uh,
2476.
histay me.
Is it what do you have the Strong's number there?
The
The
strongest
two
number is
two four
2476.
seven six.
Yep.
Yeah, okay, so I did write that there. So there are many verses that make like to stand, establish. I wrote some verses
Confirm.
down. Psalms 119:38. I don't know. I remember back in the day, I just like went to the Greek Septuagint and was like looking at how is this word used.
When he says I
Uh,
took away the first and established the second, what do you guys think he's talking about? Is he just
I think
talking
it's
about
talking
the
about the first covenant.
sacrifices?
No, the covenant.
yeah, he what is it? The night before he died, he said, "This is the new covenant in my blood, given for many for the forgiveness of sins." Right?
Because you also have to remember that the law in Hebrews chapter 7 says, if therefore perfection had been reached by the Levitical priesthood, by which the law was enacted for the people. And then it talks about how that there is a change in the law, but as there is a change in the priesthood, of necessity, a change in the law also occurs. So there was something that happened. So just like, Hebrews 8, yes, it was still being done actively on the earth, it was obsolete. No longer. God had kind of killed it, but still there was like a 40-year grace period that he gave Israel, so all Israel shall be saved, in my mind. He still gave his first bride that 40 years so that they can come out and that they wouldn't, I mean, that's what the whole book of Hebrews is don't go back, don't go back. Jesus is the fulfillment.
First Corinthians chapter 9, this whole idea about like the different laws. First Corinthians 9, verse 19 or 20, verse 20. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. So Paul makes it pretty clear he's not under the first covenant, the law of Moses, but he's still under the law. He's under the law of Christ for the new covenant, or whatever you want to call it.
What do you guys think about verse 10 where it says the body of Jesus Christ once for all? You think all means all there?
I mean, yeah, the offering was made for all. It's just now the stipulation is how does that sacrifice get applied to you? And it's through true biblical faith.
Well, and again, I guess like I was thinking about people who will have different views on when it says, by that will we have been made holy, through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Like, who is the we have been made holy? Is that people for all time? Because I know, obviously, we all know that there's some people who would argue that it was only the people in the first century that the Hebrew writer's writing to, that they were the ones uh, made holy through the
Yeah,
offering of
that's I
the.
kind of think that's what it's meant, that we is the, you know, those during the first century or whatever. But then when it says all, it's contrasting, you know, we who have been, witnesses to Christ or whatever. But then, that's why I think the all means all.
I mean, is it all in the sense of all people, or is it saying that the ones who have been made holy, they're going to be made, they are going to be in that form, or they're the ones who've been made holy, they're going to be holy for all time?
Yeah, I think it means for all people, but you know,
Because I guess it
I mean,
doesn't
because
say, it
the
doesn't
main the
say,
main contrast is, in my mind, you also see how you have these sacrifices being done year after year, where it's like continually being done, where Jesus does it once for all, meaning like there's no longer a need for a continual offering because
if,
he's already made it. So if you're in
yeah,
Christ, your sanctification is complete. It's been perfected because in verse 17 he says, and also it says also he adds, I will not at all still remember their sins and their lawless deeds. Well, the reason that God no longer remembers your sins is because your sins have been completely atoned for by the once and for all offering of Jesus.
if I think people really do realize that, whether they want to admit it or not. Otherwise, if people think it was only for the people during the 80-30 to 80-70 time period, why is it after 80-70 we don't pick up doing animal sacrifices again, like before Jesus came? Like, shouldn't we be doing that if Jesus' death isn't for people post 70 as well? Shouldn't we be going back to those things?
That's what I was earlier.
that's actually a good point. Yeah.
Yep.
It should be
Yeah,
just
man.
um the same as the Old Testament, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, if
Interesting.
faith is still the same as the Old Testament, why shouldn't if Christ just died for that period, that's actually a good point, you two.
Yeah.
Let's see.
I have another thing. This is one in my mind, which is a pretty cool thing. We all know the textual variance within the manuscripts when it comes to, the Old Testament, the New Testament, but in verse 5, it says, "For this reason, coming into the world," he says, "sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you prepared, but you prepared a body for me, or a body you prepared for me." And if I look real quick in like the ESV Bible, because that's a quote from Psalms 40.
Verse 6.
Yeah, so I go to Psalms 40, verse 6. It reads, "In sacrifice and offerings you have not delighted, but you have given me an opened ear. Burnt offerings and sin offerings you have not required." So, like that phrase, "but you have given me an open ear," versus what the Hebrew writer says, "but a body you've prepared for me." So there is
And
definitely a difference there.
right,
I
but
always thought that meant like his death, but actually it could just mean
well,
that that body's been prepared for God, huh?
well, I think if you go
Yeah,
back to
yeah,
verse
verse
one,
10.
verse 1, the law is a shadow of the good things coming. Like the law being a shadow. If you go back to the shadow in the Mosaic law in Exodus 21, you read about the Hebrew slave that would serve for 6 years and go out as a free man on the seventh year. But if the
Mhm.
slave plainly says, "I love my master and my wife and my children, I will not go out as a free man," because he wants to stay with his wife and his children, then he comes and gets his ear pierced or his ear dug out. And so that marked that piercing of the ear marked him as a permanent servant, a permanent slave forever by choice. So every time someone would look at that person, they would know that person has freely chosen to be a slave forever by his own choosing. And I think that's exactly what you see in the body of Jesus. When God took on a body, I think it was permanent. Christ will forever be in a body. Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely like a good teaching way to kind of like still utilize the Masoretic text. But the problem is, what did the actual text of Psalms 40 say? So we have the Masoretic text, which was completed in around 1000 AD, where we know obviously the Psalms were written way before that. But we also have the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews was written in around, what would you say, 62, 61, 63, 64, something like that?
Yeah, probably a little later, probably mid 60s.
Yeah, so he's referencing Psalms 40, and he's telling us that that's what the text reads, "but a body you've prepared for me." So, and then also you have in verse 10, where it says, "By which we are sanctified through the offering of the body." So you have two the bodies, and talking about, being sanctified by, because it says here in verse 5 again, "Sacrifice and offerings you do not desire, but a body you've prepared for me. You do not delight in burnt offerings and sin offerings." But the reason is because it's a continual thing. But Yahweh's always prepared the body of the Son, that he took on that body. That was the ultimate offering, once and for all. So when I look back at Psalms 40, verse 6, I definitely lean towards, the Greek Septuagint, which was written in around, I mean, I think most scholarship would say like the first five books were written in 250 BC. So obviously the Psalms and stuff came afterwards, but it was written before the first century. So, I mean, maybe he's not referencing the Greek Septuagint, but he's referencing the older Hebrew manuscript that predates the Masoretic text, that predates the Greek Septuagint, that the author of the Hebrews had, but has been lost to the sands of time. But The one thing that we do have is we have the New Testament written in the first century, which lets us know what the Psalms actually said. So, according to the author of Hebrews, Psalms 40, verse 6 does not read, "But you have given me an open ear," but it reads, "A body you've prepared for me."
Well, either way, it's obviously about the body of Jesus. Whether
Yeah,
you think it's about the Jesus on the cross, or you think it's about that also encompassing God desiring a human being, someone in a body who would freely choose to serve God forever as what God desired. Either one or either way or both. It's obviously about Jesus. So, um,
What do you guys think of verse 7, where it says, "Then said I, lo, I am come. In the roll the book has written me to do thy will, O God." I would think some people might argue that if Jesus is God, why doesn't it end with saying myself or something like that instead of "oh God"?
well, he's all because when he became a man, he he also says, what was it, John 20, verse 17? He tells Mary, I'm ascending to my
my
Father and your
God.
Father, my God and your God. Right.
Yeah.
So as a
You even
human,
have
he has a God just like we all do, but he also it's what is well we haven't got to it yet, but
Hebrews.
Hebrews 13, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He offered up worship to God because he's a man, but he accepted worship from people because he's also God. Right?
You also have in Hebrews chapter 1, which even most Unitarians would agree that where it says,
Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you.
yeah, it says, "You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Because of this, God, your God, has anointed you with oil and gladness besides your fellows." So here is the Father calling Jesus God.
What is it? Is that verse 9?
Yeah, verse 9.
Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you. Yep.
So the thing is, it's kind of understanding like what that term God is. That's just kind of like their title. They're all God, but there's just one being.
Yeah, it's like, was it
One being is
the
God.
multiple Yah, like Genesis 19:24, the Isaiah 44:6, you have like two Yahwehs in one verse, right?
Hmm.
Over and over in the Old Testament. But they speak with one voice, two Yahwehs, but they speak together, saying in the singular, I am the first, I am the last, no God besides me.
Yeah, there's another verse I'm gonna look up real quick.
Yeah, in verse 11 too, I just noticed, and it says, because it says, a little bit previous that when the Levitical priests offered sacrifices, it could never take away sins, but he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down at the right hand of God. So I mean, you either have like, you know, are these sins forever that is the sacrifice, or does he forever sad? Or to me, it's
Well,
forever. The sacrifice is forever.
right. And what about, so if the Hebrew writer tells us that the animal sacrifices could never take away sins, he said it back in verse 4 also, right? It's impossible
Hmm.
for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. So if the people in the Old Testament time period did not have sins actually removed because of the animal sacrifices, and some people think Jesus didn't die for those people, how could the Old Testament saints be saved if it wasn't through? Because without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness. Hebrews 9 verse 22. I know we've already gone over that in the previous chapter. Hebrews 9:22 says, "Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness."
yeah,
So if it's not the blood of animals and it's not the blood of Jesus, then how are the Old Testament saints saved? Because it requires blood for forgiveness.
That's a good point.
yeah, yeah. Again, like the old law was just that shadow leading up to Christ. Galatians chapter 3 was the schoolmaster. The entirety of the law, all that brought you to Christ. And I found the verse that I was looking for. It's Jeremiah 32, verse 27. It says, "Behold, I am Yahweh, the God of all flesh." So was Jesus in the flesh?
Yes.
The answer is yes. So that means that Yahweh, God the Father, is his God.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Verse 12 talks about he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies are placed footstool for his feet. I know a lot of people think that that hasn't happened yet, but if you keep in mind who the enemies of Jesus were and who the enemies of his church were, it was the Jews, Old Covenant Israel, and the Romans. And in 66 to 70, they were certainly put beneath their feet. So, beneath his feet. So, um, let's see.
Oh, I have a really good one. In verse 18, I remember I was speaking to this is back in the Hebrew roots days, a really like Jewish, like messianic Jew guy. And he said, this is the verse, this is the only verse in the entire book of Hebrews that's wrong. Not that it's been corrupted, it's just that it's just wrong. Where it says no longer an offering concerning sin. So like where there is remission of these, meaning our sin, there's no longer an offering concerning sin, because according to his eschatology, according to Ezekiel chapter 40 through like what 47 or 48, that supposed third new temple that's coming soon in our future, that there is sin sacrifices being done. And he takes that temple not to be the temple that, in his view, that would be, this is the millennial temple. Jesus is actually doing this. Because in Ezekiel chapter 40, there's a figure called the prince. And this man, this prince fellow, is offering sacrifices.
Wait, so this guy thinks that Jesus at some point in the future is going to offer animal sacrifices?
Yeah, I'm gonna show you.
But
Let's see.
like that's
Yeah,
literally
verse
like,
Ezekiel 45, verse 22. It says, "And the prince shall make ready on that day for himself and for the people of the land a bull for a sin offering." There's multiple sin offerings. I just have in my Bible highlighted in green sin sacrifices in the book of Ezekiel, starting in chapter 43. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 mentionings of sin offerings in this supposed either the third temple or the millennial temple. But in futurists' view, it's all well after 80-70
well,
that you have these sin sacrifices taking place. Whereas the book of Hebrews, chapter 10, verse 18 says, "But where remission of these there is no longer an offering concerning sin."
Jesus is the true temple. John chapter 2, destroy this temple in 3 days, I'll raise it again. Jesus is the true temple. He tabernacled among us, John 1:14. So he tabernacled among us. He's the true temple. And when he was here on earth, under the law, he was born and lived under the old law. He offered animal sacrifices. He kept the Passover.
And also think about this: the actual temple itself, the actual tabernacle, was just a shadow of what Moses saw on the mountain.
Yes, and we haven't got to it yet, but it's in the same chapter coming up in a few verses in verse 29. How much greater punishment do you think will be deserved by the one who has trampled the Son of God underfoot and has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he was made holy and has insulted the Spirit of grace? I mean, if you think that Jesus' sacrifice, his blood is not sufficient, but you're going to have an animal offering, an animal sacrifice in the future for sins. How is that not directly doing what the Hebrew writer says in this verse? Profaning the blood of the covenant, trampling under your foot the Son of God. I mean, that's exactly what they were doing. After the cross, these people, and the Hebrew writer is writing to, were going back to the old covenant, offering their animals again. Like, it
Oh
makes
yeah.
no sense. I mean,
I mean, that's a big Hebrew roots perspective, though. I don't know. I mean, I've never heard like a lot of Christians, like, non-denominational people say that, but I
no,
mean,
no, definitely not, because they would be guilty of throwing Jesus, stomping on Jesus under their feet and insulting his blood, saying it's not sufficient. We need something more than your blood. Like, we need animal blood, not your blood. That's horrible.
yeah, I always pictured it kind of like Jesus lives forever. People always come into Christ forever. So Jesus's blood would always have to be running. Like it's never dries up. It's that fresh liquid forever. Whereas the blood of bulls and goats is going to dry up and decay, loses its power. Whereas Jesus's blood is eternal. Maybe I shouldn't say eternal, but forever, since he took that blood on. But yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, you got the lamb slain from the foundation of the world, so you could maybe argue that.
Yeah, maybe.
But
But maybe the phrase "his blood is eternal." I don't know if he necessarily had blood prior to the incarnation. I don't
right.
think.
So yeah, it starts getting pretty heavy when you get into thinking about those kind of concepts. Like, I was reading this Leighton Flowers book today on the Potter's Promise, and in this book he talked about God's how did he word it? It was something about God is not all powerful because he's sovereign. He's sovereign because he's all powerful, or something like. Basically, his point was God's omnipotence, like his all power, is an eternal attribute, but his sovereignty is not an eternal attribute. Like, to be sovereign, you have to be over creation. You have to be over you have to be over created things.
Yes, I get what you're saying. That
Yeah.
creation wasn't. It's not eternal, so he can't be
Right.
sovereign for eternity.
Right. Right. Mm-hmm. Like, it
Yeah.
was basically like him going into the discussion about the Calvinistic eternal decrees, right? Eternal decree and stuff. Um, or also, he brought up some good points about, like, when the Bible talks about foreknowledge, like why does the Bible even make a distinction between foreknowledge and God's all power or whatever? Like, if they're one and the same, or what, like, basically the point is, like, God, just because God knows something's going to happen doesn't mean he determines and causes it to happen, right? So anyway, um,
Yeah.
all right, Rob just jumped off. We got through the first 18 verses. Anything else anybody wants to bring up on the first 18? Guess we got through almost half the chapter, like we thought we would.
Yeah, I think it's a good place to kind of stop. So I got to go to bed too.
Well,
It's 12 o'clock.
we got through the first 18. We got through the first half, so hopefully we'll finish it up next time or whatever y'all want to.
All right, listen, y'all have a blessed rest of your night, and talk to y'all later.